Hello, and thank you for joining us today to discuss test optional. What do the numbers say? Since COVID hit us and schools went test optional, college admissions landscape has gone kerflooey with applications soaring, people really not knowing, do I submit, do I not submit, is it important to take tests? And so I am so delighted to be able to host Brian Eufinger, who is the co-founder of Edison Prep, which is probably the preeminent test prep agency located in Atlanta, Georgia, although he works with students across the country. And he's going to give us the real skinny on what's going on in the test prep landscape, how schools are thinking about it. We've got some schools like the University of California schools who said they're not going back to testing, and yet other schools like Yale and Dartmouth are now requiring. So he's going to give us a skinny on what is it that you need to know as you think about your test prep plan. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. So we're going to dive right in. We got a lot of fun data to talk about tonight. I love screenshots and keeping receipts, so we're going to go dive right in. So some topics tonight, we're going to talk about what's the interplay between grade inflation that's been happening at a lot of schools and how that has impacted test optional policies, a review of all the data these past 3-4 years, who benefits and doesn't benefit from the policies, do you get an advantage for submitting, and then some fancy things like missed withholding and imputing we'll talk about later. And some trends we see going forward. So a little about me. My wife and I are nerds. We both paid for all of college via these tests. We met. Hopefully no one talks about ACT scores on first dates, so we didn't realize we had the same life story, which is we both grew up broke, and I was not a recruit athlete and needed to find a way to pay for college. So we are big believers in, I approach this whole thing from a place of gratitude, just because it's commas, it's rectangles, it's reps. The tests aren't magic, but we've tutored 23,000 students over the past 14 years from 28 states and 6 countries last year. So that's what Zoom has done for us. But yes, we do 95% of what we do is SAT, ACT, and then a little bit of subject tutoring. Now, I got a call from 11 Alive News here in Atlanta a couple months ago, and the weirdest way to start a phone conversation is, I'm looking for this guy named Brian. I'm like, that's me. She's like, I've heard you have lots of data on why test optional is a big lie, which is a really funny way for a journalist to start a conversation. And I said, well, it's not always. And she said, well, let's do an interview. I'm like, okay. So the stuff we're going to show you is a lot of neat stuff that I showed her, and the whole story got reworked because she had a narrative that was going to happen, and the narrative couldn't based on the stuff I showed her. Now, I have assembled the only group of students, all your students were the only ones in all of the nation that did not cheat their way through cyber school because they're awesome angels. But just so you know, all of their friends 100% did. Kids told us all kinds of fun things during cyber school. So, basically we had a lot of shenanigans going on. So you'd think that the GPAs would crater, but the GPA trends do not reflect that at all. So this is not the data from the feds. The feds compel this data every year to be collected, and you look at it, just look at that last year with COVID, pow, an extra 10% jump all in 1 year. But most parents who were in high school in the 90s, et cetera, this was not the norm, your mother's grade inflation. And so what's happened is now 80.6% of kids have an A minus, or A plus GPA who are at 4-year residential colleges. So compare this graph to the next graph. So for the first time since I've been alive, and I'm not young, the average dropped below 19 or below 20. It's always been hovering between 20 and 21, and it's dropped to a 19.5. That's with some people opting out. If everyone were forced to test, it'd probably be more like a 17 and change. And so learning loss is real. People are recovering some, but this and this do not match at all, which is causing a lot of the confusion you see on parent Facebook groups. Now, a lot of people talk about grade inflation. No one talks about grade compression. So you guys are here tonight, so you benefit, because what bothers me is schools have these profiles where they show their GPA distribution. This is the high school we pull the most students from in Atlanta. Forget the valedictorian in the top left corner. The middle. Are you telling me 6.5% separates the bottom 25% from the top 25%? So have your student please work really hard. No junioritis, no sophomoritis, no senioritis, because working really hard and your friends not could have you jumping over 40% of the whole student body. And yes, at this school, does that mean that not a single child for any reason that orange arrow has below a 79? C's were a thing in the 90s. They were a definite thing in the 90s. So if you're curious about grade inflation, if you type my last name in grade inflation, a really great podcast, that's my other pet issue, pops right up. Now, this is not just my opinion. I love David Graves. He runs a really great blog for the University of Georgia, our big flagship here in Atlanta. When I paused a tutoring session that I was in to screenshot this, because I know this, because we tutor 550 kids a year who get into Georgia. But yeah, he's like, oh yeah, this is 2020, pre-COVID. Yeah, 92% of semester grades at Georgia, not at Harvard, were A's, and then 8% B's, and then rounding error C, D, F. So the number one thing, as good as it would be for me if all that mattered is test scores, keeping the B's to a minimum and staying away from the very scary C's is the number one most important thing. Now, this is another thing where I stopped my tutoring session to screenshot it. I've been told lots of things in private for a long time, but the first time in public recorded history for any admissions dean has ever said this is back in November. Emory's dean, Emory, locally here in Atlanta, he said in an Inside Higher Ed article in print, publicly published, he said, we're not trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Students trying hard, but it doesn't really attach to what it used to. We are going to use external validation going forward more often. AP scores, SAT, ACT. We need external metrics to help separate it, because if everyone's in this tiny range, then it's a big, giant tie for everything. So I admire his candor. I mean, this kind of stuff's been said to me in many forums privately for many years, but now publicly for some. Now, the test optional landscape, all that's a backdrop of if GPAs were really spread out and like they were maybe 30 years ago, it'd be easier, but they're not. And so that's what's causing confusion. So about 10% of colleges, a little less than 10% of colleges are test blind, about 10% of colleges are test mandatory, but that messy middle right there, about 80% of schools are test optional. So what does that mean? There are 100 different definitions we'll talk about in a second. So what test optional does not mean is test blind. Test blind means we are not using it at all, like the University of California system. Test optional means it's optional. Doesn't mean it can't help. Like AP classes are optional. They really help. Dual enrollment classes are optional. They really help. And so it just means you're not automatically clerically rejected because you didn't submit that one number. So it's a de-emphasis at some schools. Now, there are places that use it where they're test optional for admission, but not for merit aid. There's lots of different classifications. So let's look at the spectrum. There's some schools that are test required. There's all the military academies, Georgetown, MIT, Yale, et cetera, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, et cetera. So there's a bucket of those, 8 or 10% of schools. Then there's schools that are test expected. So Purdue is still test optional, technically. But this is from last month, 97% of kids who got in sent scores. That doesn't feel very test optional. And we have some parents who are unhappy about that, whose students will not be Boilermakers next year. They did not listen to our advice to send. And then there's ones that are test required with rare exceptions. So Duke is test optional, yet 93% of the kids walking around campus sent scores. So 7%, like running backs and Governor Abbott's son and whatever. There's a million different categories. A lot more than 7% of people fit into a special category. And then there's Auburn. They're proud of it. They coined the term test preferred on their website, which means we really prefer it. Only 3 to 6% get in each year without scores. But then, just to say, it is true. There are schools that are test optional. Let's talk Pepperdine. Look at this. This is from the common data set. Only 22% of kids from Pepperdine sent scores. They mean it. And California is SAT, ACT blind. They still use APs and other things. But as a general rule, one really good thing, if you look at my gesture, this right here is the Pacific Coast. If your state touches the Pacific Ocean, do they probably mean it? Yes. In the other 47 states, is it a definite maybe? Well, you'll see the rest of the data in this presentation, but yes, it's a mixed bag, but it's not, it's a different world out there. Now, let's talk about the common data set. So you can get a copy of these slides if you'd like, but tables C7 and C9 are huge. They're underutilized. So the common data set, you can look up any school, like I just showed you, what percent of kids sent scores. If only 10% sent scores, go have fun, go ride a bike, do whatever. If 93% sent scores, that's not really optional. And so that is a piece of research that your student, since they're going to college, not you, should definitely engage in to see that data. There's a great website that this College Dataverse that has a lot of them pre-saved for you. It's amazing. But I was speaking at Clemson last month at a conference, and it was awkward because the head of admissions, or one of them, was in the room. And Clemson, this is from Paying for College 101 group, the column of things they consider really important is just GPA, rigor, and test scores, yet they're test optional. Not a single thing is even in the important column. And then over there in the corner, considered maybe, is the essay, the recommendations, et cetera. That does not fit the narrative you see online. So there are parents who are unhappy when they start doing this research. Now, who is more likely to benefit from these optional policies? Hooked versus unhooked really is destiny. So if you are the secret valedictorian of your school, where they're going to put a big magnifying glass on your GPA when you don't send the scores, yes, that could work out for you, but it's meant for institutional priorities. So it could be first-gen college attendees, athletes, legacies, full pays. They want to have at least one kid from all 50 states, et cetera. So the less you have special categories, the more likely it is you should try to really have some great scores to send. Now, the number one beneficiary of test optional policies is the colleges. They get more applications, more revenue. They look better in the rankings, and we can say, oh my gosh, look how selective we are now. But what is decreasing is the acceptance rate, but also the visibility, the fog of war into exactly how the decisions are made is what is also caused to happen. Now, the data on the next slides I'm going to show you, we're going to dig into it. We don't live in an ideal world, but I am an expert at collecting the very few morsels of data that schools are willing to release. And so Rick Clark, who's amazing, recently departed, but he's now in a different role, head of admissions at Georgia Tech. No fan of tests. And even he has had it. He's like, I'm frustrated. In his blog, he's like, it stinks for kids these days. But like, ideally, college would actually release this data, what percent sent versus didn't send, what percent got in, didn't send. And as he said, we are not living in an ideal world, honestly, and nothing close to it. So everyone's frustrated, including people that are even not such big fans of tests. Now, what's also important is, again, your student does the research, not you, because they're the one going to college, is look at the fine print at various colleges, because you might be test optional, but not for the honors college, but not for merit aid, but not for your homeschool, but not for direct admit business or nursing, but not of this and that. There's secret extra fancy essays like Carnegie Mellon that pop up at the last second only if you don't send scores. So there's a lot of surprises that you definitely want your student to research for sure. I'll give you one example. I tutored a girl for 10 hours a week. That is not what I do normally because she didn't even take a mock ever. And she went and toured Elon University Columbus Day of her senior year. And luckily, some lady asked, "You're test optional, right?" And the tour guy goes, "Well, I mean, not for homeschool or nursing or business, but the rest, yeah." Well, she wants nursing. And so we tutored her boyfriend. The girl called me in a panic, took a mock. I will not say what her score was, but we tutored. She went for it on fourth down in December, and luckily she got what she needed. But her mom was super religious, and she was ready to fight. She's like, "This is these scoundrels. This is so dishonest." And like, she should have looked on the website because it's pretty obvious, but most people don't do this research. There's definite giant asterisks on a lot of these categories. Now, these two slides, my friend Brooke, who has an awesome YouTube channel, you look at the data there, you look at this sorted. So if you look at Washington and California and Arizona and Oregon, like again, West Coast, of her sample that she surveyed us, what percent of students sent scores, is a lot of West Coast stuff. We're leading the pack as far as the ones that truly almost no one sent stuff. But at the top, the more higher ranking ones and the non-West Coast ones, in some places you have Georgetown with 102%. People send both because we really want to show you those scores. So the higher ranking the school, the more likely that you are sending, 70, 80, 90, 100%. Of course, a lot of these are back to mandatory now, Tech and Yale and Georgetown, MIT, Purdue's going back next year. But a lot of schools have gone back on this list right here. Now, context does matter. I admire Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh literally, they mean it. Like they publish this data, and almost no one does. Yeah, at nursing, we really expect scores. Only 11% is nursing, but 50-50 if you are arts and sciences. Unfortunately, most schools don't do this. But the more engineering-y and business-y and nursing-y you are, those tend to be ones where they mean it a little less. And the opposite for maybe the art school, et cetera. Now, the four-legged stool. What is useful? There's grade inflation, like I talked about. What if I'm not an admissions officer? But if you just tell me here in Atlanta, hey, here's this kid named Caleb, and he goes to Lakeside High School, he has this GPA, he's taking this many APs, here's his test scores. I'm not even an admissions officer, and no, I'm not at Harvard, but at many, many schools, I could get half the way to the decision, or at least the context, understanding what is going on just with those big four legs. And so in COVID, if you started losing some of the GPA stuff with cyber school, some of the test scores, it was a really hard job for these admissions officers. And so now, like it could be Jimmy Carter, it could be Bill Clinton, it could be today. It's a top 21% score, it's a 25 now and forever. They set the stage that way. So Duke's admissions dean, he did an interview with the student newspaper during COVID. And when he said, there were certainly some students where we wish we'd had scores and we didn't. That's such a polite way of saying, understand your context. Now, students might be book smart, but they might not be nuanced and street savvy enough. And you as parents can help them understand your context. The last thing they need is, Sarah from Westchester, yet another, they have enough of Sarah from Westchester with good scores, much less without good scores. And so it's really about your understanding your context for sure. That's it's awkward to have that discussion with parents, but it's better than not having it. Now, Harvard, I think it's funny because Harvard is still test optional for another 4 years, but for the last 10 years, the red box at the bottom, they say in black and white, first sentence right there, SAT and ACT tests are better predictors of Harvard grades than high school grades. Well, of course they are, because the range of grades is so tiny. It's just universal good grades out there. That's Harvard, who's test optional. Then Dartmouth, since I presented at Clemson, they went back mandatory, as was covered widely everywhere on the internet. But there's a podcast. If you type in data dive standardized testing, it's the first thing that pops up. If you're really curious with this stuff, it was just an interview of Dartmouth and Yale, the two deans, talking to each other. It was an amazing podcast, but one of the best of the past 5 years. But of course, Dartmouth and Yale, both famously, oops, did go back mandatory. But this slide right here, this bottom of the half of the page, the Yale dean said, you don't get smarter by poking one eye out. We really are losing some really important data in the process that would help us admit someone without losing the context if you have no context. Now, Brown, to be clear, Brown is the least school on earth I would ever think would say this, because they're more hacky sack and a little out there than some schools. But their president said, no, we like our hacky sack. We want some smart hacky sack players. And so she basically said, yes, standardized test scores are a much better predictor of academic success. So we'll see. They're coming out with their decision in 2 weeks, but whether they are 93% of kids at Brown sent scores or we're back to mandatory, it doesn't necessarily make a difference functionally. Now, this happened at Clemson, and he would not let me. This guy, awesome guy, I couldn't even tell you what school he works at because he didn't tell me. He was hanging out in the hallway ready to talk to me after my presentation at Clemson. He works at an ACC school. That's all I know. He said I can quote his conference. And he said to me, that was a great presentation. He's like, he's at a school that, it sounds like he's at a school that is not yet back mandatory, but wishes they were. He goes, if there's some kid in South Georgia who has a good GPA at 26 ACT where the school average is 16, I want to see those scores. I'm 1,000% bidding that kid. He's earned the right to come try. But you wouldn't know that. Now that kid might just read some blunt rule that says based on XYZ of what some lady says on a Facebook group, I'm just not sending. And that stinks. And so that he loses that context. And I asked him, can I use that quote? Can I quote you? And he goes, I have a mortgage, which is the best way to respond to that question. But I appreciate that he let me use his ACC quote. Now, I do admire a couple schools do release this data. So a couple months ago, Fordham did release their data. And of the very, very few schools that released their data, the students who applied test optional to Fordham this past year got it at 52.8%. And those who sent their scores got it at 74.5%. So you got it in 141% as often if you sent scores. And again, the number of schools that release this out of 2,000 in the nation is in the dozens, like 2 or 3 dozen, unfortunately. Now, to send or not to send is a very controversial issue. It depends on your list. You might send to some schools, not other schools. Obviously, if you're above the top 20, in the top 25%, you send. And above the median, you send. Now, inside the middle 50, there's a lot of debate, but in general, I like to tell people, look at the middle 50%. Like what percent of kids sent it. That flavors it a little bit, because even if you are right near the bottom of that range, but it's a school where 93% sent, that might mean you want to send a little more than at a school like, hey, Pepperdine, where easy breezy, it may not matter either way or at all. Now, what bothers me, I'm a pretty mellow dude. It's hard to get me mad, but this feels very dishonest and shady to me. Tulane, SMU, plenty of schools, High Point, as is featured in this slide, call our students all the time. And students sometimes are too naive to understand. One of our students got called by Tulane because High Point emailed, don't create evidence. Tulane's at least smart enough to call people on the phone, and they told our student, so we heard you accidentally submitted your scores. And she was like, no, I'm really proud. I got a 30. It's a top 7% score. So we heard you accidentally submitted your, and her mom had to nudge her. And so she unsubmitted her scores. And like, it's super dirty. It's like, there's less risk of sending your scores than you think, because you might just get a call like that where, okay, then. So I don't know. I don't know what else to say with this slide other than it feels wrong. Now, one important thing is this narrative out there on mom Facebook groups is, unless you have a 36, don't bother, you're not getting merit aid. I'm from St. Louis. Let's talk about my flagship where I grew up. So at Mizzou, a top 40% score is all you need to get to the bottom level of their merit aid grid, but that's 34 grand over the course of 4 years. And the top level can be, 85 grand. And that's for non-residents, and, not a crazy stat. So yes, obviously Harvard does not have a giant merit aid grid like this, but plenty of schools do. Auburn and Mizzou and Michigan State and Utah and just hundreds of schools have these merit aid grids that you can look up. We live in a golden age of merit aid grids if parents want to look up some of these things. A lot of places people do not pay the sticker price that you might be scared of. Now, during COVID, the anthem was test optional applicants shall not be disadvantaged. So by definition, if that's true, then wouldn't that mean that people who submit scores are not allowed to be advantaged? That's exactly what that would mean, but that's not what happened. So you have a sense of my style by now. This is Bradley. He does not exist. That's just a generated picture I made via AI. I have a son named Bradley Danielson that has never graduated from high school. He's a junior, has been for the past 14 years. He's just a fake Gmail address that my admin uses to do fun mystery shopping and other things. And so I had my admin email the top 200 colleges in America, did some phone calls, emails, etc. And over 150 did not reply at all. Of those who replied to the question, what percent of people who sent scores got in versus not? Of the ones who did respond, most of them said we are not authorized to divulge. If you have to say divulge, that's just as good as give me the number anyways. But this is, to their credit, the 15 schools or so that released their data. So depending on which school, for a long time, Boston College led the race as the biggest fibber out there, where you got in 120 to 270% as often if you sent scores. And this is back in 2021, 2022. People like me who screenshotted this data are responsible, unfortunately, for this data never being released for class of 2024, et cetera. So we had a good window. We're glad we saved the data when we could. It's not happening anymore. Now, not to be outdone, Auburn did not say hold my beer. They said hold my keg, and they came in, boom, 800%. They will never be dethroned as the leader in the nation from that standpoint. Now, I want a screenshot. So my student who was going to go to Auburn on a tour, I said, go be a paparazzi. I'll pay you $50 for a couple minutes of work. How about that? And I planted the dad in the front row to ask a question about test optional rates. And so we'll see whether the audio plays. If not, I can just tell you what he says. It's a 5-second clip here. Okay. So in case it didn't play, he said, for in-state, about 10%, 8 to 10%. For out-of-state, 5 to 7% admit rate for those who did not send scores. That's the last piece of data I needed to do the backwards math on their data. So yes, Auburn and Tennessee are the two schools that have gotten by far the hardest over the last 5 years compared to their former selves. But for those who send scores, it's still a coin flip. It's still 47%. Whereas out-of-state, we've tutored 7,000 kids as a company since COVID, and since we're right here in Atlanta, a lot of kids apply to Auburn. We have not yet had one get in. So big difference, 800%. Now, this is my favorite slide in the whole deck. It's a little bit on the nose. When the word test optional first became a thing, my mom, who's super old, I was a miracle baby at an old age, she started sending me newspaper clippings. She doesn't have email through the mail saying, did you hear about this test optional thing? Are you have new babies? Are you going to be okay? I said, Mom, it's okay. I was in a corporate cubicle for a long time. I understand corporate doublespeak when I hear it. They're not telling the truth, but if they are, I'm entrepreneurial. I'll figure it out. I have a lot of things I'd love to do, but here we are. I'm exhausted. So we for the first 12 years, we were just my wife and I. And then we've grown from 2 to 14 people because that's how test optional is. Believe me, I need a nap. I'm not tutoring any fewer hours despite us having 700% the team. So it is what it is. This is the proof's in the pudding. Now, where are things? So what bothers me it's an anti-student policy. Many schools do this whole kick the can, one more year syndrome, like reluctantly, late in the game, barely, after being begged by people, please tell us what you're going to do. That attitude tells you exactly how they feel. When William and Mary went permanently test optional, they mean it. Like, great, like that's so liberating versus the not telling you till it's too late. So here we are. I'm getting more calls from sophomores right now than juniors, have been for a while. So we're so late in the game. The majority of juniors are already done, yet they haven't even said to the juniors, are you going to even require it? So they tell you a lot based on when and how they're dribbling it out in 5 years, 1 year, or when. That tells you how they feel about test optional, truthfully. Now, this is, as of when I spoke at Clemson, January 23rd, a list of schools on the right-hand side. All of those had not yet announced. A couple of these have announced since then, but not many. Like Carnegie Mellon, I emailed them, or my fake email address emailed them, and they said, expect something this summer. Like, there are a couple that said we won't announce till sometime this summer. That is nuts, but that is where we're at. Now, one important thing, the link is on this slide, so you can read it later if you want to. There are some schools where they have these antiquated systems where they need a formula. They need a way to sort things in the rankings. And this is, again, the Gates Foundation, no fan of standardized testing, but to their credit, they put in the report, they interviewed a bunch of people about how they do test optional admissions. And a couple schools admit, yeah, like we just have a formula where based on zip code, other metrics, past kids from that high school, we try to just assign them give a guess to what their score was. That has not been communicated to any of the people applying to those schools, whatever mystery schools they are. They didn't say which ones they were. And that feels wrong. Like, tell a kid, do you want a black box to assign you a score based on your zip code in high school, what we think you might have had? Or would you like to do that? That's another one of those things where it's awkward. Don't know what else to say. Another reason to take the autonomy back and put your best foot forward and put your score, not some assumption, in that box. Now, the pendulum is swinging back, as you've seen in this last slide, to test mandatory or test preferred or test expected at a number of schools. The higher they're ranking the school, the more likely. What's been happening is, since January 7th, that was D-Day, where pow, the second that the New York Times article came out on January 7th, nothing's been the same since then. I don't have to argue with parents on the phone anymore. They believe it. I'll talk about the New York Times in a second. But why things are trending back is because the data that's been released in these articles that have been covered in the New York Times and elsewhere shows that, it's like that saying, like, capitalism is a horrible system other than most of the other things that have been tried. Like, test options is a test, standardized tests are a horrible thing other than most of the other things that are tried, like who's doing some pay to play various activities and mass essays, stuff that might have been highly influenced by mom, all kinds of things, etc. And so this is just a smattering. There's been 100 articles I could show you screenshots of since January 7th, but the big one, if you only read one article, just type in the misguided war on the SAT. It's a very important article. And again, if you've lost the New York Times, you have lost. If you've lost Jeff Slingo, you've lost. If you've lost Nate Silver, you've lost. So the narrative has definitely changed. And the funny part is, Jeff Slingo quoting the head of Georgetown, who's the most happily protest school in the nation. He's like, "Yeah, my friends know that if they reinstate it, they'll get their hands slapped, they'll get in trouble, they won't get invited to some cocktail parties. Like, it's not politically correct, but like, there are a lot of people that want to go back, but their boss won't let them." And that's essentially what's been said to me in other forums as well. Now, the winds have shifted, because if operative range of the GPA is smaller, grades are still number one factor, should be, but they mean less if everyone has a giant tie. So keep your grades up, but know that the 4.0 is not given the same weight as it was when it was more rare. And the SAT scores are predictive. Part of why Yale and Dartmouth went back is they said, that it was the number one most predictive factor in freshman GPA retention. Did they fail out? How are they doing? And it does improve equity relative to other criteria. I didn't have a tutor. I went to Barnes and Noble. I bought about $50 of books and I whaled away at some tests. And that was pre-YouTube, pre-Khan Academy. If someone cares, but very much so. For $1.50 of Goodwill Hunting-esque library finds, people could study on Reddit, on various places. So it really is one of the most fair things you can do. And it's just stuff you're doing in college: reading, writing, arithmetic, data analysis. It's just those skills you're going to be using the rest of your life. Now, the danger is, I don't know what the mix of people who will be watching this as far as high schoolers versus their parents, but the danger is in students not getting this message, missing these shifting winds. Parents can know about it. I know about it, but it's very hard for students if their friends are being lazy, especially in a world that has TikTok and things. Well, Bobby's not trying. Why should I care? Either it changes your odds of getting in, or the price tag mom and dad are paying. It can be, one of the things I take pride in the work I do is it's a win-win-win. Like, I'm changing parents' retirement dates in a lot of cases when, oh, hey, look, I got this one score, so Auburn's giving me an extra $79,000. Like, that is of after-tax dollars. That is not nothing. So getting in better schools or saving money or both, keeping your grades up and getting good scores, taking hard classes is key. So please communicate this to your kids. Now, I want to leave time for talking. What we do, I'll give you 30 seconds what we do. I'm weird. I'm a heretic among my tutor friends in that I'm happy to do private tutoring or group tutoring or whatever. 95% what we do is SAT and ACT, but 91% of our students either start off with or only do a group class. Obviously, I make more money recommending private, and I'm happy to, but depending, if Jeremy has a 24, 24, 24, 24, they're much better off doing a class to build a foundation and a little fine tuning if needed. So my wife says it's my Catholic guilt that does not let me recommend pure private to everybody, which is probably partially true because I grew up broke. But this stuff is not about ooh la la fanciness. It's about getting someone who knows what they're talking about and then putting in the reps and having parents gently or not so gently monitor whether homework's happening. Because again, I keep telling people commas, rectangles, reps is the thing. The other thing is, if your student's taking a bunch of AP classes and they're on the 5-yard line, we're trying this a little more, can get them a 5 and get them credits. I started off as a second semester freshman and double majored in 4 years with no stress. not because I'm cool. I just did what my friends were doing and it worked out. But if you're a student on the precipice, we do one thing, AP history boot camps, because a lot of kids, it's the most popular one. So we do that one weekend each year. But that's all we do as a company. We stay in that lane, and you guys are in good hands with Steph. I got to meet her during early COVID when one of my friends who's a tutor in Texas like, yeah, you should talk to Steph. You and her have a lot in common, and she's really solid. So that is how I got here today. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. I see there's something in the chat already.
Thank you. And again, if anybody does have any questions, if you just want to pop them in the chat, or I guess in the Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But maybe I will start. One of the reasons that, pardon me, that I asked Brian to do this session, obviously there's a huge landscape of SAT, ACT tutors globally in the country. One of the reasons that I asked Brian and why I've really wanted to partner with him is not just because he's so very good at what he does, but he is in fact probably the most reasonably priced test prep person I have met across the country. And so if you're like me and you're a business person and you're looking for ROI, Brian is definitely somebody who you should consider reaching out to and seeing if what they offer might be a good match for your student. Let me just ask you a few questions. I know everyone's probably looking to have some dinner, and I appreciate that you were able to keep it to 30 minutes because I know you just condensed a 90-minute conversation into a 30-minute conversation, so I appreciate it.
Sure.
What advice would you have for, say, our younger students? So I have a lot of people who come to me and say, you know, their friends are doing test prep in 8th grade.
Yeah, that's not needed. Yeah.
What advice would you give to those families? How should they spend their time? When is the right time to do test prep? What does that look like?
Sure. So I just sent you a link in the chat. So there's a site, edisonprep.com/sophomore, which has a beautiful 6-page PDF that if say your spouse couldn't be here tonight, but would really benefit from some high level stuff. But basically, yeah, first 2 years of high school, please get good grades and take hard classes and get involved in some activities you care about. Other than that, that's mostly it. So when I get calls all the time, my 6th grader at Johns Creek Elementary click, because there's nothing that can be done well. It burns kids out. And so part of the reason the ACT recently put a cap where you can only take it 12 times. So my wife and I, we are the awkward old people in the room. So SAT still takes your money. And so we can still take the SAT, but ACT I'm banned now because you time out after 12 times. So we're nerds. So I am one of the only people in the nation, maybe the only one who's gotten back to back 36s. My wife always beats me since she's our lead SAT tutor, but we're nerdy like that. But nothing should happen right now. And they put the 12 test cap to stop parents of 5th graders from having the poor tortured 5th graders taking it too early. So yes, the earliest eager beaver people is this. Whatever your math track is determines everything. If you finish algebra 2 as a sophomore, game on. When once sophomore year's over, you have 90% ish of the content you're ever going to get. So if you don't cover grammar much after 8th grade, etc. On the other hand, if your kid's not starting algebra 2 until junior year, ethically, I can't really do much until 2nd semester, junior year. And so that is the tail that wags the dog. Math is everything. But that said, I believe just from a stressfulness and mental health standpoint, every plan I design is tries to get, if sophomore year's over and junior year is not, it's a great time to be taking the test. And every plan I design based on whatever variables a parent gives me, my kid is the quarterback or whatever. I try to make it sure that they can be done ideally by the June test of junior year, the latest. Senior year tests are legal, but they're stressful. Like filing your taxes on April 15th is legal because the thing is, and I will be an apologist for kids a little bit. Senior year is a cruel joke already because you have college visits, college applications, college essays, fall sport, fall schoolwork. You toss on SAT, ACT. So we've had 280 kids get perfect scores over the years. Not a single perfect score yet has happened to a senior. I'm waiting for the first one. Then I'll say one. It's fine. But like, it's not because they're bad people. It's because you're already overwhelmed. And so if you can get it done earlier and go enjoy the rest of high school, you will have so many fewer slammed doors in your house. And this should not be dragged out. Like if you have reasonable scores and reasonable goals, like pop, like take it consecutive test dates while you have momentum. One of the things I didn't mention is super scoring. So parents of older kids who are on this call, 5 years ago, only 10% of schools super scored. Now it is upwards of 95%. Unfortunately, UT Austin is one of the stalwarts that does not, at least for the moment. Wisconsin, Penn State, UT Austin are the big three, at least in Atlanta, that people get mad about. But now schools mostly have policies where you can mix and match your best English from one day and your best math from another day, which is partially leading to this score inflation because kids understand the strategic value of taking it and trying to super score your score. So that is why you want to give yourself a runway. Look at the overall testing calendar of all 7 test dates of the year. And if 2 of them are out because of prom and the track meet state finals, well, then go ahead and take it earlier in the year or vice versa.
So when I have the 8th graders who say, oh, but my friend's doing test prep, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, I tell them the number one thing they could do now in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade before they finish Algebra 2 is read.
Absolutely. Yeah, reading. I mean,
Read
like
books.
my mom was a
Any
high school.
suggestions on the kinds of things they should be incorporating in their reading? Because I always think that math is a lot easier to improve through a test prep program like yours, but reading comprehension is a muscle that is built over time, and it's hard to do in like a 3-week boot camp.
Yeah. What's funny is I have a couple kids who are young prodigy types who are parents who are very aggressive. So RSS feeds are a thing that faded away. I've always loved them. I still use them. I have some kids who like during COVID had a lot of boredom and they found what do you really like? I like technology and green energy and I love to read about like World War II. Like I just like finding things you're passionate about is going to keep kids sticking with it. And so I have a kid who literally he either wants to be a historian, like write the great novel about World War II stuff, or he wants to do green energy. But he just curated that when he had 3 semesters. There's one school district here in Georgia that was cyber virtual for 3 full semesters. He had a lot of free time, and so letting kids explore their passions will make them stick with it. So it's not about the exact content. And as far as the math goes, there is something that I will say is amazing. My buddy who lives in Manhattan, and therefore he was locked down pretty hardcore during COVID. He built a tool as he watched his own biological children's brain just melting, sadly. It's called Math Chops, and it's just mathchops.com. It's free, or you can do like a little upgraded version, whatever. But when I have kids who come to me and the parents want to start in 9th grade because you don't understand, my kid is the worst math student ever. It's very low stress. It's just sort of gamified and like it's I wouldn't call it Candy Crush. It's not that fun, but it is harmless. And like I'll have kids who are really bad at math start that a semester before we work together. The one girl I started with last week, actually, she had answering all the questions, had a 13 on the ACT math, which is just a couple questions about randomly guessing. And so when she started with me, she would do that during her study hall slash health class, which is basically a study hall. And she, before I met with her, got herself to a 17, which doesn't sound like much, but she went from missing like 40 questions to missing 28. And so that's not nothing.
Super. Any other questions? We
I
just
did
have a
drop
question that's coming in. I was actually answering via typing, but it'll be easier to do it live. Brian, just a quick question about if you could explain what super scoring is.
Yeah, so if you take it twice, say you get a 24, 24, 34, 34. One of our students just got that. And so she is great on those 2 sections. And so I told her, you have my permission to never practice the reading and science where she got a 34 ever again. And she got 2 24s on English and math on the ACT. That the February test just came out this past week. And so instead of doing all the tests, I'm just giving her double duty homework on her 2 lower sections. So that way, if next time she gets 30, 30, but gets a 32, 32 because she's a little rusty and not practicing it, great. Now she has 30, 30, 34, 34, and can have a much better score. That is what's the first year that UNC super scored, their average went up 2.5 points purely due to super scoring is a very, very powerful tool. Now, one thing's important is I did drop a link into the chat, edisonprep.com/mocks. We have free mocks every weekend, as well as an asynchronous one. It's a cartoon looking version of me proctoring the mock. So if you have a busy athlete, they can do whatever. But either, depending how busy your kid is, I tell people, because the hardest part sometimes is getting kids to just take the freaking mocks because they, sports, etc., life. And so you can either compare the PSAT score to a mock ACT or take one of both. And so either one of those ways is an acceptable way to make the Pepsi versus Coke decision, because only 10%. As the funny part is, so the Texas tutor that I'm friends with thinks I'm crazy. We just have different sets of clients, but we We have 3,000 students a year, and pretty consistently, 45% of kids do way better on the SAT, 45% way better on the ACT, 10% are truly tied. And since I want a happy high schooler, if you are truly tied, I'll be like, you know what? Which one do you prefer? I want a happy student. And so, but only 10% do I not have to lay the hammer down and say, no, you're so much better on ACT, we can't even look at SAT. So
Well, and I'll
mocks.
give you a very personal story. So I grew up in Canada. We didn't do testing in Canada. So I had one shot at the SAT, which I took at Princeton High School during their homecoming parade while I had the flu. I took one shot at the ACT, which wasn't much better circumstances. And like Brian, all I had was a book because we didn't have test prep. So I didn't have the benefit of great tutors like Brian and his wife. I had a book, which I actually had to buy from a bookstore because Amazon didn't exist. And with the same prep for each test, on the scales have changed, so it's not meaningful to give you the numbers, but on my SAT, I scored an 86th percentile. Okay, like fine, not great for Penn, which is where I went undergrad. But with the very same amount of prep, the ACT, I scored a 99th. And that was my saving grace. So with the same amount of prep, I was definitely wired for the ACT. So I just want to echo Brian's advice. Before you spend any time or money in trying to prep for either test, figure out which is your test and only do that when there is no reason to do both.
And one thing also, it's a free country, people do whatever they want, but we don't do these like timeshare pressure sales pitches. Like when you take the mock, we email you the results and say, if you want to call us, please do. If not, no hard feelings. Like that's just how we operate. So, because that is normal in the industry, right? You have to come here to get the results and get the. I'm honestly too busy. We have 5-year-old twins. I'm busy. If you want to help, we're happy to help. But one other thing I want to mention, because I get this question all the time in parent meetings, it sounds like to say, oh, great, you can get merit aid. One very specific example, a guy who works in our office park, he's a friend. We've been office neighbors for 10 years. He's not from this country either. He was your country mate, Steph. And so he's like, this is garbage. Like college is so expensive. It wasn't that way up there. And so he's mad because he can't afford full price Auburn. His son very much wants Auburn. His wife went to Auburn, etc. And so he was working at Firehouse Subs 12 hours a week. And I'm close enough with it. He's not a client, he's a friend, so I could be a little more blunt with him. I said, I'm not judging your parenting, but just letting you know I'm judging your parenting. If he does not quit Firehouse Subs, he's mortgaging his future for $9 an hour, 12 hours a week during junior year. If he can get, he had a 28.25, which is one question below what you need for any merit aid money at Auburn. And I just showed him the grid. There's 215 questions on the ACT. I said, he's missing about 56. If he can fix 26 of them, not even half, you save $82,000. I said every question might be most of a mortgage payment. And so his dad didn't tell. I mean, I said just have him quit. His dad went and quit for him that day. Or if I and he, but this is the funny part. His son's like, "What did you do?" He said, "You're gonna come to my office. I don't trust you. You're gonna surrender your phone to me, and I will pay the same $10.50 an hour that you were making at your job over there, unlimited, no cap. You can go in the conference room and wail away at tests." And the kid thinks he won. The dad paid him a couple $100. Dad gets the other $80,000, and so it wasn't very hard. And so once the kid started going up, because he didn't really believe in himself, because he has really smart friends, his dad didn't have to motivate him. It's like your friend who goes to CrossFit and tries to recruit you into their CrossFit cult. It's like no, like it's people. You start losing when you start losing weight. Like it's the same analogy. When you start working, you won't have to convince your kid to study. Like, oh, this is cool. It's like a video game. Let's keep getting further. So, but that's a big thing. So he's not a wealthy dude. He's just a guy, and $80,000. They could not have afforded Auburn, so now he can. So win-win. So those stories happen every day.
Well, I think that's a really great place to land. So, Brian, I want to thank you so very much for giving us some insight into the current landscape, the importance that testing still plays, not just in admissions, but in the very important financial decisions and merit aid. And of course, I would invite anybody, if you're interested in following up with Brian about his program or how he might help, I might actually reach out to you about the AP World Boot Camp because my kiddo's taken that. But thank you so much, and really appreciate your guidance and appreciate your willingness to help all of these kids just blow up their futures and just grab all of these opportunities that lie before them. So
Happy to help.